When was the last time you've watched or read a good war arc? A war arc that really made you go, yeah, that's what the story was building up to. A war arc is something extremely high risk, high reward, because it's very hard to write a coherent, easy to follow and impactful large-scale conflict without losing yourself or the reader. But if you manage to pull it off, war arcs have the potential to become the most memorable moments of your work, and they can generate lots of badass wallpapers. First, let's define it. A war arc is a type of arc in which all of or most of the story's biggest players finally meet for a big epic confrontation. It's when all of the foreshadowing and training pays off, and they usually shift the entire narrative around. Despite the name, war arcs don't necessarily have to be an actual war, just fit the description, although most of the bigger ones are actual wars. I'm Luke, and today we are going to talk about war arcs and see how to pull one off for your own comic. We are going to be looking at a few examples of great war arcs and see what made them work the way they did. But before we do that, let's talk about what makes a war arc not work. Because picture this, imagine you have somewhat of a fandom already. You've gathered a little community, and after like 200 chapters you finally arrive at your much anticipated war arc. The big battle of the big boys, and you wanted to do this section of your story even before starting to work on the actual comic. You were really excited to do this war arc. Everyone is hyped, but then when you drop the newest chapter, silence. You don't see much of a reaction from your readers. Not a lot of discussion or theorizing, so you keep releasing the arc's chapters. Still nothing. But you notice the viewer base is shrinking. People are actually dropping your comic. And when you try to understand and search around to find out why they are leaving, you find out they just didn't find it very interesting. The arc was just boring and confusing. And to make things worse, now they don't have anything in your comic to look forward to, since this was the big hyped event. And this is heartbreaking, because this war arc was supposed to be one of the peaks of your story, one of the highlights. Now that would be very depressing, right? You might laugh at the melodrama, but this is absolutely real. So let's see what can go wrong when writing a big war arc. Having a war arc literally means you're gonna have to manage a lot of different characters and their points of view. You could just focus on a few or maybe just one character, but that would completely kill the sense of scale and depth of the arc, making it so that's not a war arc, it's just an arc in which there is a war happening. You can do that, but the point of a war arc is to be massive, and in order to achieve that, you'll probably have to manage a lot of different points of view, which requires attention because the reader needs to have a general idea of where every POV character is at any given moment, and also what each of these characters are trying to achieve. Like, yeah, they are at war, but this one wants to open the big gate to help the troops, and this one is fighting the bad guy, and this one is holding off the minions. If the reader doesn't know where each character is and what they are trying to do, it's hard for them to care because anything can happen at any moment. And at this point, they're just watching / reading a bunch of fights and explosions without any real story to it. Remember, even in a big massive war arc, what the reader cares most is the characters and what they want. So the war in question needs to have something related to the characters' interests and personalities. Just plain old geopolitics or the war must happen won't cut it. You kind of need an intrinsic reason for the reader to care, you know, just like any other arc or story development. And on top of all that, the war needs to be clear and easy to follow. The reader doesn't really need to know every single detail of the fight, but they should have an idea of who's winning, where the troops are, what the place looks like, this type of stuff. Let's now go for the good examples, starting with what's probably the most iconic war arc in anime. The One Piece Marineford arc is all types of epic, and it is a textbook example of a good war arc. The animation does hold it back quite a bit due to its age, right? It looks kind of old and bad by today's standards, but regardless, people still consider this one of the best, if not the best, war arc in anime. And it all comes down to the writing. Just imagine how Marineford would look like if they reanimated it in a movie with today's technology. It would be an event. So let's talk about what makes Marineford so good, without spoiling too much. I'm gonna give you the short version of the context for this arc. The Whitebeard pirates are the big boys of the seas. They strike fear and respect all across the Grand Line, and they are the crew most likely to find the legendary One Piece. Because of their sheer power, there was naturally a lot of tension between them and the world government, so a war between them was bound to happen from the beginning. But that's the thing, Stuff like that can be hard to care about because even though it's badass, there's not really a beating heart to this conflict. It's just politics, and most readers and watchers don't care too much about that stuff. So the stakes escalate when the world government captures Portuguese DAs, who's a member of the Whitebeard crew, and they are gonna execute him publicly in a show of force. The Whitebeard pirates, however, are not gonna allow that. And so, that was what really started the war. Which is a little better, right? The reader is more likely to care about the conflict if there's a human in the center of it, if it's to save a life. But then you add in the fact that he is Luffy's brother, so he, as well as us in the audience, really care about him. Having Ace in the center of this conflict was a great way of not only inserting Luffy into a battle that he has no business being in, but also creating a very specific emotional goal. And with that, we have a war arc that was bound to happen for us to finally see all the major players finally using all of their power, but also a simple, strong, emotional purpose for the protagonist to be there. It's not just politics, Luffy is there to save his brother. The Marineford arc serves as a pivot, an essential movement for the overall story, because in it, a lot of payoffs happen and character arcs end. But at the same time, there's a lot of foreshadowing and hints for future events, which is very cool, because even in story, there are these themes of passing the torch and the new generations starting their journeys. Use war arcs as a multi-purpose arc, to finish the stories of multiple characters in a conclusive way, and at the same time use it to start other characters' stories. A war arc is essentially one big dense section of the story that feels massive. It is the ending of some arcs and the beginning of other arcs. It's like a big multi-purpose tool. Jujutsu Kaisen is peak. When I watched the first season, I decided I was not gonna read the manga, because I really liked the adaptation, and so I was going to wait for the next seasons of the anime. And so I would always see my friends talking about the Shibuya Incident and how traumatizing it is and how sad and all that stuff. And naturally, I got really curious. Now, with the second season of the anime and the arc masterfully animated, I can tell you that, man, I was not expecting that fabled Shibuya Incident arc to be a war arc, especially not an awesome one at that. The Shibuya Incident showcases how you can make a hype war arc utilizing modern anime technology, but one thing that can feel jarring for some people is how early it happens. Usually war arcs happen in the middle of the story or at the end, right? They are usually there to serve as a pivotal moment in the story. So there seems to be no point in having one as early as season 2, right? But JJK is just built different. Sure, there are a few problems you have if you try to pull off a war arc this early in the story, like people not caring enough about the characters yet, you not having enough main characters so you need to introduce them in the middle of the war, but all of this can be ignored if you just make the war itself worth it. In Jujutsu Kaisen's case, something very fun happened. The war arc is not there to finish a lot of stories or start new ones. The reason the arc happens this early is because it wants to raise the stakes of the entire story. Think about it, all this arc achieves by taking Gojo out of the picture, killing major characters, showcasing absurd new levels of power. Everything is there to take an otherwise loose, kind of messy narrative and streamline it. Now the stakes are clear, the powers are defined, everything got elevated, so in this way you can see that war arcs can achieve pretty much whatever you want it to, if you have the skill to pull it off. Every fight in this arc is interesting, including the much anticipated Yuji vs Mahito fight, finally ending that rivalry. Overall, the Shibuya Incident arc feels like a hard turn for the story, making it so the stakes didn't increase gradually, but suddenly skyrocketed, and I feel like this is one of the reasons for why it is so memorable. Now, it's important to remember that we are taking for granted the fights that happen in these arcs, since at the end of the day, despite its objectives, a war arc is just a big compilation of major characters fighting. So if you don't get the fundamentals of a fight right, what was supposed to be the most hype moment of your series will become a pain to go through. I have a video on the channel called How to Write the Perfect Fight Scenes, so if you want you can check it out. And now for a war arc, we have Attack on Titan's War for Paradis arc. Honestly, this one showcases what I think is the biggest flaw in AOT, which is how quickly convoluted the story got. Like, I have no problem with how complex it got. It's just that it was a bit too fast. Like in one moment there was just the walls and the king and all that stuff, but then all of a sudden there is a whole entire world of lore for you to keep up with. And like, I did keep up with it because I watched a lot of AOT videos on YouTube back then and read the manga before the anime entered its 4th season, so I had a lot of time to let the lore sink in. But for a casual viewer just binging it, there's just no way they'll be able to keep up with everything and really understand it. So explaining what this final arc is about for someone who hasn't watched Attack on Titan without spoiling anything is pretty much impossible, but I guess I'll try. This one is an actual war as well, so bonus points for that. This arc is a great example of sheer spectacle and horror. The rumbling is unforgettable and the mass destruction that unfolds is just something else. This is an example of something a war arc should absolutely have. Spectacle, big effects, gorgeous scenes, wallpapers. Because a lot of the people watching had no idea what was going on in the story, yet they still watched it because it looked so spectacular. A war arc is supposed to be great and epic, and this one does this perfectly. The War for Paradis arc is a bit different than the other two we talked about, because in this one side has a significant advantage over the other one, making it so it's a struggle, not a fair fight. What we can learn from this arc is that, even though it is well written, style sometimes can be a replacement for substance. Because even if you just start watching this arc with no context, you will still probably enjoy yourself just from how cool the scenes and action are. So a perfect war arc needs to make sense in the grand scale of things, but also have a central emotional hook related to the characters. It needs to have a big character-driven purpose and not be just an abstract political fight, and it needs to fit its place into the larger story, starting, progressing or finishing character arcs. And of course, it needs to be cool, filled with great fight scenes and fun stuff. I have a course for writing webcomics, all I can say now is, the best is yet to come.